Everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have quite a turnout expected, so this should be a really interesting forum. So I'm going to start, we're going to start by introducing the moderators and the organizational sponsors of tonight's event. My name is Rachel Stevens. I'm an executive committee member for the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club. Sierra Club, Vermont is part of a national organization, one of the oldest conservation organizations in the country. Sierra Club works on anything from climate to forests, water, social justice issues, and we do have a local chapter of volunteers. In my day job, I work as an attorney at the Environmental Justice Clinic at the Vermont Law School. Lily, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Lily Platt. I'm a senior at Harwood Union High School in Central Vermont, and I'm a leader of the Vermont Youth Lobby, which is a statewide coalition for climate action and climate justice, led by young people.
Lauren?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren Hurl. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters, and we are a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works to advocate for strong environmental laws, hold lawmakers accountable using things like our environmental scorecard, and we also endorse candidates and then actively work to elect candidates who share our values and visions. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Sheldon?
And I'm Sheldon Goodwin, and I work with Lauren at Vermont Conservation Voters as the Political Outreach Associate. And I'm also going to be introducing the other organization that's involved in this event, which is 350 Vermont. And 350 Vermont organizes, educates, and supports people in Vermont to work together for climate justice, resisting fossil fuels, building momentum for alternatives, and transforming our communities towards justice and resilience. So we want to thank them for helping to put on this event.
Great. So before we move to introductions, Lauren, could you kick us off on what to expect?
Yeah, so I'm going to walk through the ground rules, the flow of the evening, so you know what's coming. And first of all, for those who have jumped in late, please make sure that you mute yourselves so that we don't have a lot of background noise, and we can really focus on what our candidates are saying. So we are going to be asking the candidates a series of questions on a range of issues that are important to our organizations and important to our members. We sent these questions to the candidates ahead of time, so they had a chance to think about them. Each question is going to be asked by one of our moderators. They will let the candidates know when they're asking the question if they have 1 minute or 2 minutes to answer that question. We're going to read the question in full at the beginning. Some of them we provide a little context. So we will also be posting them in the chat box. So if you want to follow along with the question, it will be there. And so we'll read it for the first candidate, and then when we move on to the next candidate, then we won't repeat the question, but it will be there for people to refresh ourselves on what issue we are talking about. Steve Crowley from the Sierra Club is going to be serving as timekeeper, so you'll hear some beeps popping up, and that's when we've hit the time mark, and we've asked the candidates to just, after they hear that, wrap up the remarks so we can keep things moving and keep it fair so everyone's getting the same amount of time to answer the questions. This is not a debate, so we're not incorporating rebuttal directly into it, although we are going to allow a little bit of response if somebody talks about something directly to do with another candidate. So there, you might see a little bit of response time, but mostly it's focused on giving each candidate the same amount of time to answer each question. Everyone throughout this evening, if you are not a candidate or a moderator, please remain muted. We encourage you to use the chat function to keep the conversation going. If you have thoughts, if there's questions that are popping to mind that you hope we might ask, that would be great to see. We really want you to be engaged and part of this conversation. What we're going to do is at the hour mark and again, at the end, after we've gotten through the prepared questions that we want to get through, we're hoping we'll have a little time so that we can pull some themes out or some great questions that you all have come up with. So we'll really be monitoring that and looking to see what you all hope the candidates will speak to. So if we have time, we hope to get to some of that. If not, we'll just make sure we can at least get through all the issues that the candidates have been sent ahead of time. We do really want to stick to our 7 to 9 p.m. time slot. So at 8:50, no matter where we've gotten in our agenda, we're going to go to our last question and give each candidate 2 minutes to make their final pitch of why they think that you should vote for them. So that is how the flow of this evening is going to go. Again, questions, issues, please get chatting. I'm going to turn it over now to Lily.
Thanks, Lauren. So before we begin with questions for each candidate, we'll have 1 minute introductions, starting with Pat Winburn.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the Sierra Club for sponsoring this forum. I am Pat Winburn, and I'm from Bennington. I'm a candidate for governor, and I'm an attorney. I've been an attorney for more than 3 decades here in Vermont, fighting in the courtrooms, fighting against big corporations, and fighting for the powerless against the powerful. And again, I appreciate you allowing us the opportunity to address the Sierra Club, and we look forward to having a good forum tonight.
Thank you, Pat. Now, David Zuckerman.
All right. Well, thank you so much for hosting. It's been such a pleasure to work with all 3 of these organizations for many, many years on climate crisis issues, on toxics issues, and so many others that you've been advocating for. As many know, I'm David Zuckerman. I'm your Lieutenant Governor, and I'm also a farmer growing organic vegetables and animals. I'm a small business owner, and of course, I'm running to be your next governor. And I really jumped into this campaign in large part because the crisis of our time, the climate crisis, has just been becoming more and more paramount. And between that and economic injustice, and obviously now we're talking a lot about racial injustice, these issues are critical and at the forefront. And we're at a turning point in our future. Are we going to keep going with a governor who's laissez-faire and lets things kind of float along? Or are we going to have a governor who's really proactive? As a legislator, I helped lead the way on amendments and on bills around the climate crisis, on toxics, on sustainable agriculture, and many environmental issues with many of these great organizations and others, often pushing the legislature farther than it was ready to go and pushing whoever was governor farther than they wanted to go. We have an opportunity now to put someone in the governor's office who's ready to go farther, who's ready to tackle these crises with the urgency and need that we need to address them, because clearly we cannot continue on the steady state path that we've been under for the last 4 years. So I look forward to being your governor. I look forward to working with you. I've worked with you for many years, organizing around the state on these issues. And in particular, I want to thank I want to thank all of you, 350 for bringing a lot of young people in, but also the Sierra Club for helping sponsor the movie series that we've brought issues around the state, around the climate, with Awake, and with the Devil We Know around toxics, and then also around social justice issues like 13th and Awake, which tackled both climate and social justice issues. So thank you for all the work you've done. I look forward to working with you in an inclusive administration as governor.
Thank you, David. And now Rebecca Holcombe.
There we go. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for convening this event to talk about issues that are really important. And I really want to call out and say thank you to you, Lily, for your brave courage all the time in making us all be accountable to creating a good future for young people. I want to be able to look back in 20 years and say I did everything I did to create the future that you deserve. Because right now we face a crisis of democracy. We face a health crisis. We face an economic crisis, a racial justice crisis, and an environmental crisis all at the same time. And I want to thank you for showing up, because in the face of all of these threats, I know it can be so difficult to stay engaged and stay present to fight for that vibrant, sustainable, and equitable future Vermonters like you, Lily, deserve, that Vermont promised in our Constitution and that we know we need to be. In a crisis, it's really tempting to seize at things that promise this feeling of immediate safety, and that's what we've been doing. But managing a crisis is like running around your house during a huge rainstorm, putting buckets under the holes in your roof. And more than at any time in my lifetime, I know our future depends on all of us standing up and demanding now that it's the time for a new roof. We've had a governor who's fixing a crisis. He is not planning for the future that we know we need. And we need to do this now more than ever because we're running out of time. I'm grateful to the Sierra Club for convening this event, and I'm grateful to everybody listening in for showing up and being engaged as we work to create that better future for this great state. As a principal, a district leader, and as your Secretary of Education, I spent my career working with diverse communities around this state to figure out how to ensure that bright future for all Vermonters, including those who were marginalized. I believe in Vermont, and I know that we can work together to come through this stronger, more just, and more resilient than we were before. So thank you.
Thank you. So we're just going to jump right into the first question. This is a 2-minute response question.
Hold on. You've got another candidate here. Are you only limiting it from some of the? Are you open to that?
Why don't you email Steve? Can you put your email? Is this a
I'm an independent for governor.
Okay, great. Well, why don't you email Lauren? Can you put your email in the chat and maybe can communicate offline, and then we can figure out how to address that. Lauren, can you take that? Okay, great.
Yeah, just put my email.
Okay, so the first question. The brutal killing of George Floyd at the hands of police has brought into broader public consciousness a reality that people of color have known all too well, a reality that has resided at the core of our nation's history. Justice for all must be a foundational value for our nation and for our state. This is about fair, unbiased policing, regulating the use of force, and finding entirely new models to ensure peace and safety in our communities. It's also about addressing a worldview that has allowed individual and systemic racism to persist, and the fact that nobody in our dominant white culture is really free from embedded racism. We hear the call to defund the police and the call for reparations. In your view, what does this mean for Vermont? How will you as governor reorder fundamental priorities and provide moral leadership in ways that actively work to dismantle systemic racism and allow us all to thrive? The first response is to you, David.
Well, thank you. Let's remember racism is a multi-generational systemic issue. It's gone from slavery through the GI Bill that excluded our communities of color and through to the war on drugs. And it starts with everyone now, especially those of us who have the privilege of being white, exploring our own biases and really learning the full history. We see this bias and racism in higher incarceration rates. We see it in our schools with higher detention and suspension rates. We see it obviously in our militarized police force with the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, and many, many others. This comes from governmental policies as well as social inequities and social injustices. And that's what's built the huge inequities in wealth. And we have to work to address that as governor and as a future in our state around land access, around economic opportunity and higher education. We can no longer have our communities of color seeing authority figures murdering their fathers, their mothers, their brothers, their sisters, their daughters, or their sons. We have to add significant funding to the Office of Racial Equity so that one person is not required to tackle this alone. And my administration will also bring people into the cabinet with diverse perspectives and experiences so that they're at the table from the beginning of the conversations, not brought in as an afterthought. I prioritized these issues when we started the movie series with the movie 13th in order to highlight the fact that slavery is still allowed in our Constitution in certain circumstances with our incarcerated population. There were more than 50 people in the State House cafeteria that night, and I remember one person expressing her deep anger and sadness that she had not known the connection between slavery and mass incarceration. We have whitewashed our history in our schools, And we have to work, and I have been a strong supporter of the Ethnic and Social Equity Study Bill that passed last year. As Lieutenant Governor, I put out news about that in my newsletter. That's what I've been as a Lieutenant Governor, is bringing these issues that are happening in the State House, as well as issues that people need brought to the State House, out to people through that newsletter. And I've worked on cannabis and the war on drugs. I heard the beep barely, so I'm going to wrap up. But the war on drugs and cannabis reform is fundamentally about racial injustice and economic injustice. Thank you.
Rachel's, let's see.
Yep, next we've got, sorry about that, dealing with two things in the chat. Rebecca, you're next.
Sorry, I'm getting a handle of the mute button here. Well, we're all appalled by the extraordinary violence and brutality on Black Americans that we've seen captured on video in the last couple months. We also know that these are only the most extreme moments of racism that happen to be caught on camera. I spoke recently with a Vermont middle school student named Julia Gennari, who finds herself standing up again and again to confront and name the racism she feels on a daily basis. And she said, I just need somebody who's a white adult to say it, because people listen when white people say it. They say they're so woke, they're so respectful, but I don't get a surrogate for my words. Nobody listens to me. And I say that because she's only in middle school, and she knows already that white people don't listen to her. And she knows that people do listen to white people. And it's important to remember that in the beginning of this debate, because racism is a white person's problem to fix. It is not Julia's problem to fix. And if there is a silver lining in the hurt of the last couple weeks and months, it's the growing realization of white Americans and white Vermonters that we really aren't the nation of our ideals until we address racial and other injustices. And as white Vermonters, we need the humility to acknowledge that these public events are only the incidents we see. And we've lost our way. When we talk about the huge hurt that people are feeling, we have to start by acknowledging that we have systematically been disinvesting in the potential of people, and particularly people from marginalized communities all across the state for the last 40 years. It's one of the reasons I'm a strong proponent of reform of our education funding formula, because we have been systematically under-accounting for the higher cost of educating people, particularly in some of our communities of color and some of our more rural communities. We also need to focus on strengthening safety nets and opportunity and good wages, so Vermonters, and especially those who have been marginalized, can be free of those privations of poverty and lack of opportunity that leave them vulnerable. With respect to the subject of law enforcement, we need to begin early, far before our law enforcement system. But we do have growing consensus about the need for systemic reform. We have to collect data, not just on traffic stops, but frankly on all contacts between police and our citizens. We need to look hard at hiring, training, and promotion. We need to really have robust policies for addressing allegations of misconduct. But this isn't enough, and we can't make the mistakes that we've made before, because we need accountability for action. When we have community oversight boards, they need to be boards with authority to force change. And when people violate statewide standards for use of force, we need to have the power to remove funding so we aren't funding state violence. As Secretary of Education, I had an equity template that we used to evaluate the equity implications of every single policy proposal that came before us. I will do that as your governor. And I was incredibly proud to receive the endorsement of Sunrise Middlebury this week because of their explicit commitment to creating a future where racial, economic, and climate justice prepare, because they realize that we can't have one without also addressing the others.
Thank you. Pat?
Well, I'm an attorney, and I just don't think we can be indifferent. As a human being and as a white person, it's my job to amplify the voices of those who are directly affected by this systemic racism that exists everywhere, from our criminal justice system to education to healthcare, and in every other aspect of our lives. Implicit bias training is needed at every level of government in our communities so that we can begin acknowledging the problem and address it. Vermont often prides itself in being the first state to outlaw slavery, but that claim is hollow if you look at our history. from the treatment of the Abenakis to the exploitation of migrant workers to driving while black pullovers. Racism is all around us. I will call it what it is and seek out the guidance of communities of color in my administration. As Elie Wiesel said, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference.
Lily?
Thank you. Our next group of questions will be about energy and climate. The United States has among the highest carbon footprints of any nation. Our contributions to the global greenhouse gas reservoir far exceed any other nation. While this problem has been created by a relatively few wealthy nations, its impacts are felt most strongly by those who have contributed the least to the problem and have the fewest resources with which to respond. Even here in Vermont, much of the impact from climate change is felt most profoundly by people with fewer resources to adapt. When it comes to policy and action on climate, Vermont is far behind where we should be, far behind neighboring states, and far behind many other nations. The following questions aim to address how you would take tangible actions to implement policies and make investments to tackle the climate crisis and our energy goals with an eye to ensuring we protect the most vulnerable in our state.
Thanks, Lily. I will be reading the first climate question. Even as our state's economy is hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis, we are not free from the ongoing climate crisis. Both represent enormous challenges and at the same time enormous opportunities. How would you redirect the resources of government to respond to the simultaneous health, economic, and climate crises? How would you engage private commerce as a partner in creating a way of doing things? What's your vision for the post-COVID, post-carbon Vermont economy? We will start with Rebecca.
Thank you. We need to, as a state, we need to understand that our future is renewable, it's green, and it's local. And that's not where we are right now. We need to stop investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure and begin to phase in support for our transition to a more green, local, renewable energy economy, and also support greater energy efficiency. And most importantly, we need to stop talking about this just as a cost, and we need to focus on it as an investment in future opportunity, a chance to redirect some of the approximately $1.5 billion we spend out of state every year on fossil fuels, on workers in other states, and redirect that into the Vermont economy, where we can support our own green goals in ways that pay good wages to good Vermont workers and good businesses right here, which then they go on and spend on other Vermonters in our Vermont economy. I believe in Vermont, I believe in Vermonters, and I know that this shift to a green energy economy is what's going to allow our businesses to be our brand, but also part of our energy solution in ways that create wealth right here. As Secretary of Education, I worked very hard on workforce development because I knew that when students left school, they needed to know that they had a good education opportunity or a good job opportunity, both of which could lead them to a good life living in our communities. And I knew that we had to invest in preparing students to work in the green energy sector or the green construction center, not just because when they walked out the door, they could earn livable wages, far above minimum wages, but also to build this future, we need people with the skills to do the work. And right now, we don't have that in state. As governor, I will lean into workforce development. I will also focus on growing the next generation of our businesses. As your governor, rather than investing our economic development dollars in trying to retain large businesses that may or may not be aligned with our brand and may have a tenuous commitment to our state, I will invest in the next generation of entrepreneurs who are growing Vermont businesses that align with our goals and will create the next generation of opportunity for people who want to live here and be part of our green and sustainable future. And I will also use the purchasing power of government to nudge us towards the kinds of big solutions needed to move us safely to advance clean energy technologies and smart grid solutions. We will need government to help support entrepreneurs in this transition and also to help create the markets that lead to the needed innovation. That's what I'll do as our governor, because I know that in the past, these big systemic changes have always been supported by the public sector. But when we embrace that, we actually create new opportunity, new options for our Vermont citizens that leave us stronger and more resilient into the future.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next, Pat.
Well, as a start, Sheldon, the Green Mountain New Deal would be a good start. Under the plan proposed by Senator Polina this past legislative session, the Green Mountain New Deal would raise $30 million from the wealthiest 5% of Vermonters, putting these dollars into weatherization, electric vehicles, and expanding public transportation is sound economic and environmental policy. It's common sense. As governor, I would use the office of governor to advance this agenda. And one of the reasons I'm running for this post is because Governor Scott has been a barrier for any meaningful change. He's failed to work with the legislature, and he plays the role of obstructionist at every level. If elected, my environmental platform would be more aggressive than the General Assembly's, and I would work to pass a Green Mountain New Deal during my first 2 years in office. Blue-green alliances of labor and environmentalists need to form to tackle this issue. Green jobs are good jobs, and until the moratorium on wind, this was Vermont's fastest growing industry. We can help the rural economy in bringing high-earning younger workers to Vermont through programs like the Green Mountain New Deal. And I think that that's a proposal whose time has come.
Thank you, Pat. David?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I've been an advocate for the Green Mountain New Deal. Actually, I phrased that soon after the Green New Deal idea came out of Washington. Within the week, I mentioned we should do a Green Mountain New Deal. We should sequester the Trump tax cuts, not just for $30 million, but closer to $100 million a year for the next 5 years to put towards weatherization, broadband, renewable energy installations like solar and wind. And we actually really have to invest in a major way. 30 million isn't even enough to really transition our economy, including supporting things like carbon sequestration in agriculture and really shifting agriculture towards a sustainable process where we're building our soil tilth and sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So it's not only using less carbon in our day-to-day lives, but it's actually pulling more carbon out of the air. I believe I'm the only candidate that also was standing at the pipeline junctions to say we do not need to build the fracked gas pipeline here in Western Vermont. With me, you've got someone who's been with activists and with organizers fighting against the climate crisis for decades. And it takes more than just adding words when running for office. It takes sticking your neck out as a public office holder and then taking the heat for it, as I have for multiple election cycles, and defending those policies in ways that earn you votes to win an election. 2 years ago, one of the biggest issues my opponent kept bringing up was the carbon pollution tax. And I was able to parlay that away and won by 18% by winning over rural Vermonters to say we need to invest in working class rural Vermonters' opportunities to succeed in the new climate economy as well. To say they shouldn't carry the burden of a high gas tax when they have to commute an hour to get to a low paying job. And that we have to make sure we keep economic justice as part of the environmental justice and climate crisis mitigation that we're doing as a state and as leaders. It's been a real pleasure to work with Sierra Club and VACV and VNRC and 350.org. And I'm pleased to have not only endorsement of Anthony Polina, who introduced the Green Mountain New Deal, but also Bill McKibben, who, as we all know, has been one of the most outspoken global leaders on the climate crisis for now many, many years. And so I'm ready to bring that experience, that leadership, and the efforts to really alter and change our economy to one that supports a climate economy, builds our rural economy, builds affordable housing in our village and town centers so people don't have to commute as far, installs broadband so people don't have to commute at all for some work, And in particular with weatherization, we need to put that into seniors' homes and working class people's homes, not just have plans and programs that help wealthier folks who can use tax credits or make the investment up front. We need to make these policies available to everyday working Vermonters in order to build the coalition to win this race for governor.
Thank you. So for the next question, also related to climate change, nations have agreed to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The world scientific community has shown that the path to 1.5 requires reductions on the order of 7% per year, with CO2 removal needed much more beyond that. In Vermont, ongoing practice and even current legislative proposals fail to meet that challenge and would lead to devastating impacts globally and in the United States. We also routinely and intentionally ignore the greenhouse gas impacts of biomass, large hydro, and fugitive emissions from methane. In all these aspects, Vermont trails behind neighboring states and even many nations. In your leadership, what specific steps do you plan to take to set our state on a responsible path to dramatically reduce our climate pollution? This is a 2-minute question, and the first response goes to Pat.
Well, many in my party have been hesitant to say it. I'll be clear. I support taxing carbon emissions and using that money to invest in renewable energy. If we accept the fact that climate change is real, which it is, then we need to take meaningful steps to address it. This doesn't need to be a regressive tax. Representative Mary Sullivan and others have supported legislation that provides different forms of rebates for lower income Vermonters. Governor Scott claims he's committed to Vermont being carbon neutral by 2050, but he's done virtually nothing to make it happen. I'll put it into law, I'll codify it, I'll put it into statute, and I'll work to exceed that goal. It won't happen, by itself. And I think that points out one of the biggest problems that we have in Vermont is Governor Scott. He's a Trump Republican. He may be doing reasonable things to deal with the coronavirus, but can you imagine 2 more years of Governor Scott and 4 more years of President Trump? I mean, I think that we all agree that Governor Scott's got to go. His principles are not those of Vermont, and I think that from the veto of family leave, from his opposition to anything meaningful to do with opioid abuse, and his opposition really to anything that's productive that gets proposed means that he's got to go. And I think I'm the candidate that can do that.
Thank you. David?
Well, I spoke of some of these issues in the last question with respect in particular to the Green New Deal and investing over $100 million a year for the next few years to expand broadband, helping the rural economy so that folks don't have to commute as far for their jobs. Commuting in cars is one of the biggest fossil fuel users that we have in the state. Weatherization, and we have to put more into education and rural economic development so people can live and work in their communities again. We need to draw people to the state, and actually through a strong Green New Deal type idea, we can actually both keep Vermonters and develop good paying jobs, and we can attract people to the state, not with giveaways of moving dollars as has been done in the past, but actually through being a place that people want to live. We have a real opportunity coming out of this COVID situation where many people living in urban areas want to live in rural areas now. And if we create the jobs and the opportunities, then we can draw those people here and boost our economy, which means we can also then invest more in education, more in higher education, and more in weatherization. We have to look at adding affordable housing into our village centers, again, so people can live and work here. We have to expand local food production. We all remember when the COVID crisis started, empty food shelves and real panic. On my farm, we actually saw a huge uptick in purchasing from local stores to supply that food. But the reality is Vermont doesn't grow a fraction of what we need to grow locally to reduce the food mileage that food has to travel and to create the food opportunity for Vermonters, both for a living and to make sure we can be fed in future climate crises. There are so many different things we can do when we come together with the vision to build for the future. I've also been talking to leaders in New Hampshire and Maine about a New England Green New Deal. So we can also work together on energy policies to make sure that a small state like Vermont gains a louder voice in the process by doing a New England-wide or a Northern New England-wide policies so that we can really tackle these issues. We also have to look at where we get our energy. Not all hydro is as green as we think. Obviously, many people on this this debate recognize that Hydro-Quebec flooded the lands of Indigenous people who have been displaced, and some committed suicide, and others have died because of this. And when we look at the climate crisis, it is actually one of the largest human rights violations to not tackle the climate crisis. When you look at world refugees, it's primarily caused by environmental issues caused by global warming, whether it's oceans rising or deserts growing. So we have to do our part here to be part of the global community and protect people all around the world and build our future here. I experienced it on the farm. The winds are stronger, the rains are stronger, and right now we're already a month into this growing season with very little rain. The little plants need that water, and I can tell you, we need to address the climate crisis or we're gonna shift away from our maple season, our ski season, and even our local food production season if we don't have enough water to draw to put on our crops. So this is top issues for me. It's why I'm running for governor, and I'd appreciate your support.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I did it again, sorry. The Green New Deal is a mindset. It's a framework, if you will, really driven by the Sunrise movement at the national level. And I'm very grateful to have the endorsement of Sunrise Middlebury, because I really look forward to acting on their core commitment to addressing climate change while equitably creating good jobs as well. It's not a single bill. It's a set of proposals and a strategy for making sure we create a bright future for our children. We've made the mistake in Vermont of allowing Governor Scott to just frame responding to our climate crisis purely in terms of cost, without accounting for the incredible costs of failing to act. He fails to acknowledge that we already make things more expensive for Vermonters through taxpayer subsidies of the fossil fuel industry. We make things more expensive for Vermonters when we don't have a comprehensive strategy for a future with more frequent and more ferocious storms, thus putting our infrastructure at risk, and our bond rating for that matter. We make Vermont more expensive when we allow those storms and warming waters to poison our lakes and streams faster than what we're willing to pay to clean them. And we make Vermont expensive when we don't account for the public health risk and the environmental degradation caused by dependence on fossil fuels, the burden of which falls hardest on our least wealthy Vermonters. And the cost of emissions nationally is highest for our communities of color, who are more likely to suffer poor health from emissions. Our state and our nation are begging for leadership on climate. As your governor, I will reframe this whole conversation to focus on opportunity, from supporting minority-owned businesses in the green energy sector to the opportunity to live in a safe environment with good jobs in green energy and green construction in resilient communities that are supported by strong local food systems. As your governor, I will advance a coordinated and coherent strategy for sustainable economic development and energy policy that ensures a supply of reliable and affordable local power, but which also protects us against our threats to public health. Specifically, I will support changes to Act 250, which does protect our forests from fragmentation, and it preserves our working lands, even as it makes it easier to build affordable, climate-friendly housing in our walkable downtowns, near where our people need to work. This is more important than ever as people come from out of state. I will embrace the Transportation Climate Initiative as the way to move the needle where the Trump administration and the Senate have failed, and invest those revenues to transition us to green heating and transportation in an equitable and just way that protects low-income Vermonters who stand the most to lose. Thank you. Sorry to run out of time.
Thank you. Our next question will be about climate change adaptation. With knowledge that our climate is already changing, and that with unavoidable additional warming, it will change even more, we need to be preparing for change. We've recognized since Tropical Storm Irene that a pattern of more frequent and more severe storms is in store for us. A host of other changes, from the ski and maple industries to periods of drought or excessive rain affecting farms, to the drying up of many food source regions affecting fundamental food security, to the public health challenges of extended hot weather and the spread of disease, are also on their way. Every one of these is likely to be experienced most harshly by those least able to respond, people who could easily be left out of the policy framework. How, specifically, will you exercise the leadership we need to address climate adaptation and resilience for our communities with vision and equity in mind? Starting with David, you have 1 minute.
Well, thank you. I'd start with returning to the fact that as an organic farmer, my work is about building the soil and sequestering carbon and making a healthier planet on the land I'm stewarding for the future. It's in my mindset, it's in my blood, it's in my work. We've installed solar panels on our pavilion to offset a lot of the energy use that's on the farm that cools the vegetables. We see the effects every single day. 2 years ago, we had 35,000 pounds fewer of food on our farm because of the drought that summer and fall. When you don't have that food, you then can't supply it to people, both through the normal commercial channels and through the donations that we make to both the food shelf and to subsidized shares of our vegetables and meats to make food and healthy food more accessible across the economic spectrum. We need to immediately find ways to also help people work remotely with better paying jobs so that they don't have to drive regularly and continuously to get to work. We have to expand broadband. As I said earlier, we have to build more affordable housing in our village centers. And we've seen the food challenges that people face and actually the impact of food issues with who is more susceptible to COVID-19. We've seen that communities of color are disproportionately affected 2 to 1 and 3 to 1 in serious illness because of pre-existing conditions, because of poor access to quality food. So food security and the climate crisis are all tied together. We have to work with Vermonters across the spectrum. I've worked with Vermonters just in the last few weeks with roundtable discussions around agriculture and ways to move more local food production. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Rebecca.
As you said, climate is inherently an equity issue, and that's why the people most affected by our changing climate need to be the ones that we consult and prioritize as we plan for our future resilience. We know that, for example, as recently as climate migrants come and COVID-19 migrants are coming to Vermont and buying houses sight unseen, those most likely to be pushed out of the housing market are those with the least wealth in the first place. And we already have challenges in that Black Vermonters do not have access to housing markets the same way white Vermonters do. State government has a critical role to play in ensuring our resilience and health as we cope with climate change. We must strengthen our local food systems to ensure food security and make sure all Vermonters have access to nutritious food. To do this, we must use the purchasing power of government and help farmers access new institutional markets in ways that strengthen and provide them stable revenues, but also help them access those markets to grow their businesses. Years ago, 2 great women representatives, Mitzi Johnson and Rosa McLaughlin, came up with the idea for our Farm to School program, which builds our health and puts the absolute best of our fields into our kids. And every dollar we spend on our local farms through our schools adds about 60 cents to the Vermont economy. This is a model for us moving forward. State government can also ensure equity in the transition to electrification of heating and transportation, because those with the least ability to shift to cost-saving technologies are those who have the most need for government subsidies to help them benefit from this transition as well. We can recognize and compensate farmers and foresters for their services and invest in communities with lower economic resilience to make sure that they benefit and come out stronger in the long run.
Thank you. Pat?
Well, Donald Trump and Governor Scott seem to be almost the same person on this issue and other issues. As many of you know, I'm sure, Governor Scott once said that climate change would actually benefit Vermont with climate refugees fleeing to the mountains. I mean, that's unbelievable. The reality is that people are and will continue to be displaced by climate change. And of course, we must ensure that they have a place where they're safe and they're valued. And affordable housing is a cornerstone of my platform. But this housing should be sustainable and built in the right locations with proper weatherization. Solar paneled tiny house communities have been a success in other countries, Scandinavia, for example. And I'm currently looking at these models for Vermont's homeless population. Also, Should we be using public dollars to rebuild structures that we know will be damaged again? Climate change isn't about to happen. It's here already. And people, the experts all agree, the real experts all agree that climate change is real, and this is an important issue that has to be addressed by the next governor.
Thank you, Pat. Now we're going to move to a question that relates to transportation as it relates to climate change. So nearly half of Vermont's carbon emissions are attributed to the transportation sector. With Vermont's rural geography, Vermonters drive 20% more than the national average to get to work and spend a large part of our incomes on gasoline and car maintenance. Numerous strategies are available to address this, including promoting public transit, rail, bicycle, and pedestrian facilities, park and rides, and electric vehicles. This could even mean fundamental redesign of community settlement patterns to accommodate walkable, bikeable, multi-use centers, facilitating the density needed to support public transit. Do you support Vermont joining the Regional Transportation Climate Initiative to limit climate pollution that could reduce climate emissions by 25% in the Northeast by 2032 and provide Vermont tens of millions of dollars to transition to a clean, modern transportation system? The TCI and its carbon reduction strategy gets us halfway to those who would be with where we should be with transportation-related emissions, so we'll need more faster. How will you allocate transportation funding, including those funds from the TCI and dedicated transportation dollars generated from other sources, to ensure an equity-based approach that reduces carbon emissions in a time frame that protects our planet? And we will start with Rebecca.
Thank you. As I said before, our state and our nation are both begging for leadership on climate action because global warming poses a catastrophic threat both to our ecological and our economic viability. Our only hope for strong, comprehensive climate action, especially given the failure of leadership at the federal level, is a governor who understands we have a big problem and it isn't going to get better on its own. We need a governor who will do the hard, dirty work to understand issues, seize opportunities like the Transportation Climate Initiative, to make the changes proactively rather than have the inevitable crisis crush us because we refuse to plan ahead. Governor Scott has said this is an issue that needs to be handled regionally and nationally. Well, we can't wait for national solutions because we have a president who is doing everything he can to roll back protections on our air and water right now. And now Governor Scott is also trying to back away from the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is a regional solution. We are too small to work on our own on this issue. And this kind of regional collaboration is how we stand a chance to bring down emissions and raise revenue to support our transition and protect rural and low-income Vermonters in that transition. As governor, I will embrace the Transportation Climate Initiative to move the needle where the Trump administration and the Senate have failed. And I will also ensure that any revenues generated are used in an equitable and just way to protect vulnerable Vermonters and rural Vermonters who have acute burdens related to transportation and who stand the most to lose in the face of climate change. That means different things in different regions and different communities. And I will depend heavily on the existing expertise in state to figure out how to invest in public transportation, ride sharing, electrification of transportation in ways that reduce our dependence on out-of-state fossil fuels and increases revenue spent in state on our small, appropriately sited and scaled renewable energy sector. I also will acknowledge that TCI is by no means perfect. No piece of policy is. And I will be very proactive to protect the interests of Vermonters and especially our equity interests, and particularly around our communities of color and less wealthy Vermonters in this transition. I will also make sure participation in TCI does not harm those small beginning Vermont businesses and industries we need to support in the green energy sector. For example, there's a risk, as currently envisioned, that it could harm smaller companies, and I will work hard to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next, Pat.
Well, I completely support the Transportation Climate Initiative. We need to rethink transportation. I've been really interested in following the all-earth rail proposal from David Bittersdorf to operate trains from central Vermont to Chittenden County and possibly beyond. And I'm also interested in microtransit, which in a sense creates a publicly run Uber so that families can get rid of that second car. Cars are expensive. And when everything's added up, the average car costs about $8,000 per year. As we probably enter an economic downturn, it would be great if we relieve working Vermonters of that annual expense. The Sierra Club's electric vehicle incentive program is also something that I'd like to learn more about.
Thanks, Pat. And last, David.
Well, thank you. Yes, I wholeheartedly support the Transportation Climate Initiative. Again, this is an issue that we've been talking about for a few years, and we recognize that Vermont exports almost $2 billion a year paying for fuel. And if we were to invest the receipts from the Transportation Climate Initiative into renewable energy vehicles and broadband and public transportation and park and rides, we would actually save Vermonters millions of dollars that would be reinvested in our local community, which would help our economy, and it would actually help the planet as well at the same time. It's really important to recognize that the right wing is going to come at any one of the three of us who wins this primary full bore on this issue. They're going to try to paint us as attacking rural Vermonters and working class Vermonters. Again, I've already faced that fight 2 years ago, and when addressing that issue, I put it to bed. And you need someone who's got experience debating these issues with those wrong attacks and able to dismiss them with the truth, which is that we can get money from TCI, we can invest it in rural Vermonters to make sure they're not disproportionately affected, and we can tackle the climate crisis. It's important to recognize that if Vermont does not join TCI, Vermonters will still pay the costs because it is a regional tax. So why wouldn't we join it so that we get some of the receipts from that tax to use in Vermont? We have to think creatively about transportation and accessibility options, of course, because the state is almost entirely rural. One of Vermont's real challenges is that we are one of the most diverse, geographically spread out populations in the country, which is why we have a 20 to 30% higher rate of mileage per person. We need to take some of that money or money from the Green Mountain New Deal and invest it in broadband, as we've said before. It's clear that that will help reduce the impacts of driving and increase the opportunity for good paying jobs and economic development in our rural areas. I really appreciate that David Blittersdorf was mentioned earlier. He's a strong supporter of mine because he knows that I've been outspoken on climate issues, renewable energy, and these issues for a long time as a legislative leader, including other issues that were brought up, like farm to school, where I was the chair of the Agriculture Committee to support and usher that bill through with Speaker Johnson, who was actually a first-term legislator that year on my committee. It was great to work with her on that. And I would look forward to working with her as governor, with her as speaker. It'd be fantastic.
Thank you, David. Now I'm going to turn over to Lauren, who's going to ask some of our questions from the audience now that we're at the midpoint.
Great. So we've been getting a lot of really great questions and context. I did want to make clear we probably aren't going to have time to get to everyone, but we're going to capture these and make sure that the candidates all have them so that your thoughts and perspectives, and they can know that Vermonters and voters are thinking about a whole host of issues. So there are a couple that I wanted to lift up, and then we hopefully will have time again at the end for a few more audience questions, so please keep them coming. And some of them, I think some of our later questions we'll get at. So first, I wanted to ask a question from Sammy, and apologies if that's not how your name is pronounced. Since First Nations people have been stewards of the land for thousands of years and hold essential knowledge of how to be sustainable caretakers for this land, how do you plan on supporting the Indigenous sovereignty of the Abenaki and Mohegan nations who steward so-called Vermont land? And I'm going to start with Pat first, and let's each take a minute.
Well, the Abenakis have been horribly abused over the course of history. They're the native people. They're the first ones that were here, and they should be respected for the place they hold in our history and the place that they hold in Vermont. The Abenakis also, it's their land. Their land goes over the border into Canada, which is an artificial border. But I think that there should be proposals that would help. It's on a federal level, but that would allow the Abenakis to go wherever they want to go on their land. It's only right and that they have their freedom to walk on their own land and to, go where they want to go.
Is that a timer or someone's phone ringing?
It's my,
Yeah, that was a phone. It was not a timer, but it is just about
like
time.
that was done, so it was good timing. Next we'll go to David.
Well, thank you. I'm really honored to have been working with Chief Don Stevens on a number of these issues for a number of years. We've welcomed folks into the building in my office where there's nowhere else to meet in the building in order to have a space for the Abenaki to gather their thoughts before testifying on issues, as well as before when we created Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day here in Vermont. They were in my office storing their treasured and sacred possessions while then preparing to speak out front. I've worked with the Abenaki when we passed the legislation a number of years ago to recognize the Abenaki in this state and give them more rights in our lands. The bill moving this year around hunting and fishing licenses is incredibly important to make it so that those are free for folks of Abenaki heritage and Indigenous heritage in Vermont so that they can hunt and fish as their traditions have been for many, many years without having to pay the same fees as Vermonters. Because again, that's part of the idea of sovereignty on the land, is that they were on this land long before all of us. I also hosted Don Stevens, Chief Stevens, for a roundtable conversation on Earth Week. And it was a real honor to hear his wise words and wisdom around the culture and the history of the Abenaki, how they treat the land, how they are stewards of the land and the animals and the plants. We have to bring in not just equity, not just justice for Abenaki, but learn from the people who actually know how to live sustainably on this land in a way far better than we do.
Thank you. Next, Rebecca.
Thank you for the question. And I would start by saying that when we stole their land, we also took away people's culture in ways that are profound. And I remember visiting a school in Swanton and talking to a community member about how many Indigenous families did not identify their Indigenous roots to the school, in part because it's within their lifetime. It was only in the 70s that we were still sterilizing people from our First Nations and our Indigenous nations. And so I would just say that as government, we have a lot of work to do to earn trust, first and foremost, and to earn the opportunity to work with and listen from people. What I would do as governor is acknowledge first and foremost that there's a different way of knowing that we can learn from in terms of how to conserve and protect the land that gives us our life. We have a tradition in the state among some of our communities of people's assemblies, and they are fundamentally different from debates, which are competitive enterprises about winning and losing and deciding whose idea is best. It's about working together to build solutions. And I think when we have that kind of inclusive process for developing solutions, we can find ways to create the more sustainable future and learn from people who did it well and did it persistently over a long term, long before we came in, and began to create some of the problems we're now struggling to survive. That's what I'll do as governor. When I was working to try to figure out how to implement complicated federal laws, what I always did was try to go first to get input from the people those laws were most likely to affect, so that I could make sure that no matter how it rolled out, people felt that their voice was present in the development. When we had to implement the Every Student Succeeds Act, we interviewed over 2,500 different people across the state of Vermont. We had an entire team whose only job was to make sure the right people were at the table. We can't solve some of our environmental challenges without learning from our First Nations and understanding the ways that they have worked to maintain and be stewards of the land that we live on.
Thank you. I'm going to do another question that we've gotten from our participants. This one, I'm going to read actually a couple different questions. So think about, there are a lot of questions in here, but I want to lift them all up. So the first one is from Jameson Davis, saying, everyone is saying the right things. I would like to know specifically in detail what each candidate is going to do for Black Vermonters. Towns, cities all over Vermont consider themselves progressive, liberal, even though studies around police interactions, hate crimes, and incarceration say otherwise. Broken verbal promises and lip service are no longer enough. Regulations and statutes need to be put in place. What have you done in the past that have led to environmental justice legislation, and what do you already have planned if you are elected? This is your chance to persuade me that real action will be done to protect Vermont's vulnerable. And just building on that, Curtis Reed had added in, moving beyond the social justice sector, to what extent are you tapping the expertise of Vermonters of color in the energy and small business sectors? And in what fields do you have access to subject matter experts of color beyond civil rights and social justice? So I know that's a lot, but let's give you all 2 minutes to think about that. I will copy those again into the text so you can see them, because I just threw a lot at you. But really great questions, and would love to hear more from all of you about that. So why don't we start again? This time we'll start with David.
Well, thank you. Those are obviously very excellent and deep questions and conversations. You know, we need to look at many, many different areas of our racial inequity in our society, from criminal justice reform, where we have an 8-to-1 ratio of incarcerated communities of color relative to population in the state, one of the worst in the country. As we just learned with COVID-19, we clearly could let out 200 to 300 people who, for health and safety reasons, so we've got to be reviewing who's incarcerated and why. State's Attorney Sarah George is now looking at every single person in their caseload to see if they are going through the system with racial bias, and whether or not some of those cases should be dismissed. As a leader, it's important to both put out statements, as I actually did just today about white privilege on Twitter, and the reality that white people do things that are, quote, mistakes or indiscretions that actually land people of color either in jail or worse. That's the kind of thing where we have to keep talking about both what white privilege is as a leader and in conversations, as well as then moving into policy arenas like getting rid of cash bail, getting rid of ticky-tacky violations of people on parole. We need to invest in education and make sure that communities of color are not disproportionately getting suspended and detained in schools, detentions, which is something I brought up and others brought up in the Education Committee when I was a senator 4, 5, 6 years ago. And it didn't get taken up by the Department of Education in the way that it could have. This has been an issue the ACLU has been pushing on for quite some time. We have to look at areas of business investment with cannabis reform, which is not only about criminal justice reform that was set up originally, the war on drugs, to actually hold down the civil rights movement and the peace movement of the 60s, but actually then use those resources for ways to help our communities of color then get into the businesses and industries, whether it's cannabis or other economic development. Just heard on the radio today, a lot of minority-owned businesses didn't have access to PPP funding because they've never gotten loans from banks because banks wouldn't loan them the money. We need to look and make sure that our banking policies make sure money is accessible to people of all backgrounds and not redlined essentially out of the opportunity for economic development. We need to look at higher education access, and we need to look at early child education and make sure we're meeting the needs of all of our kids, because if we don't get kids started on the right path early and then support them through the education system, they're not going to have access. Just the other night, I was on a Zoom call with lieutenant governors across the country and learned about an organization which was hosting young men to learn how to be teachers. So we would have young Black men, in our schools to learn how to teach and then to be inspirations for the children of color so they'd have leaders they could look to. We need to include and uplift communities of color in all areas of leadership to give people hope and opportunity.
Next, Rebecca. And I did copy the questions over because there were several parts, so please.
Yeah, it's an amazing question. What I would say is that right now, what voters, and particularly Black voters, should listen for isn't words. You should be looking for action, and you should be looking for whether or not we are systematically in every sector of this state looking at what outcomes are and what evidence we see in the outcomes, that we have worked hard to ensure equity of opportunity and that promise of life, liberty, and happiness for all Vermonters, but particularly communities that have been marginalized. And everywhere we don't see that, we know we have work to do. White Vermonters have work to do to make sure that promise is there for everybody. And that's what I'll commit to as governor, because you need action. when we talk about policing, if we have community review panels or boards that are representative of the communities that public safety serves, we need to make sure those review boards actually have teeth. If they act to recommend changes, that there's some force behind it to make sure those changes are made. Again, if there is evidence of disproportionality in policing, not just in traffic stops, but in every interaction our law enforcement has with communities. If there is disproportionality, are we making sure that we're withholding funds if we see that they're not being used to advance public safety and doing it equitably for all Vermonters? You know, this is a hard issue. I speak to educators, I speak to business owners of color. I've gotten great counsel from many people in Vermont who advise me every day. And what I would say to people here right now is our race problem is a white problem. As Vermonters, as parents, as adults, we need to ask what kind of children do we want to raise and who do we want to be? And are we really committed to the hard work of understanding and recognizing racism when it happens in our daily interactions in ways that ensure that we are not only supporting and elevating people of color, but we are also working to make sure that they can take advantage of all the assets and the benefits of the state in ways, frankly, that we benefit as well. That's what I'm committed to as governor. I will take that action. I know it's in every place. When we worked on our discipline data, we knew that our schools could not make the changes they need to make in our practice in schools if they didn't get implicit bias training and support with curriculum development. That's why I've worked with communities across the state, listen to people of color about what's helpful and how to make the changes that they need. Thank you so much.
And Pat.
I would have people of color in my cabinet. And I'd also have people of color in the process that screens candidates for cabinet level positions. I am an attorney and I've been an attorney for over 3 decades. And one of the things that no one has really talked about is that the governor in Vermont appoints judges to the bench. We have no black judges. We have no black Supreme Court justices. We have no people of color in our legal system at the top levels. And I think that that's something that really has to change. And the people who are in government and who are in judges, they really control everything that happens to people of color and all people. When I was in law school, the first job that I had was in legal services, and I represented people who are of color mostly. And we had one of the cases that we had that was of great significance was a case against Burger King. We sued Burger King as a part of a class action, and we put people and the employees of Burger King who were not being advanced because of their race or because of their gender, and we did things. As a lawyer, I'm used to getting things done. There's a beginning, there's an end, and we get things done. And that's one of the reasons that I'm running for governor, is because I'm tired of just talking and talking. I want to get things done, and that's what I would do as your governor.
Thank you. Did Rachel make it back on? I know she's been doing some. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. Sorry, I had a technical issue. So thank you so much for the audience questions, and I would encourage the conversation to continue. We do have some time reserved at the end to maybe have some additional questions. And so for the second half of the prepared questions, we're going to ask that candidates keep their responses to about 1 minute, just so we can have time for conversation. So the next question is about sustainable agriculture. Agriculture is integral to Vermont's identity, but Vermont is losing many of its farmers. Faced with simultaneous challenges of addressing water quality issues, reducing toxic chemical use, changing nutrient management practices, increasing operating costs, falling milk prices, the challenges of a changing climate, and an uncertain economy, the future of farming in Vermont may look very different than what we see today. At the same time, important new opportunities may be emerging. Vermont agriculture will increasingly become an essential component of climate resilience. How do you look at these challenges, and what is your vision for the future of Vermont agriculture? What do you see as the role of government in making sure that farming and caring for the planet go hand in hand? The first response goes to Pat.
I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about school lunches and the school lunch program. A lot of kids go to school hungry, and they deserve a free, not only a free lunch, but a free breakfast. My wife grew up in Brooklyn, and when she went to school, she got a free lunch. But she was one of the few in her class that would get a free lunch, and the people who were there saw her, and she was really humiliated because she was one of the kids that they were one of the free lunch kids. And as governor, I would provide a free lunch, and I would provide a free breakfast. School lunches should be free, breakfast should be free, they should be nutritious, and directly from farms to schools. This would be a major boost for the agriculture industry in the state, and would ensure our children aren't just eating junk that's processed with chemicals from some factory from out of state. And that's one of the key parts of my program, and would be one of the key parts of the Winburn administration.
Thank you. Next, we have David.
Well, thank you. I appreciate this question. As a farmer, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of these issues. And I started in the Intervale, where I was able to rent land and get a business and marketing and farm experience under me, to then be able to eventually buy land that was supported through the Vermont Land Trust and the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. We need to expand these opportunities for more Vermonters to get into agriculture and sustainable agriculture. I'm really honored to have the support of Clark Hinsdale, the former head of the Vermont Farm Bureau, as well as Dave Chapman, who's the leader of the Real Organic Project, with farmers from across the spectrum respecting my work in agriculture and the ability to work with all of these farmers, including folks like Krista Alexander at Jericho Settlers Farm. Both men and women and young farmers all need to be together to build the future of Vermont agriculture. We need to do both incentives and these supports, and we need to continue to expand the Vermont Grass Farmers Association and others who help farmers learn how to do rotational grazing, which is both healthier for the animals as well as healthier for the planet, by promoting carbon sequestration through rotational grazing rather than CAFO-style agriculture. We have a lot of opportunities in Vermont, both to support agriculture, but also to help areas like our dairy industry, where we could either say we don't need dairy in Vermont, or we can say, why don't we move commodity dairy into specified Vermont dairy with land protocols, worker protections for our migrant workers, and get a better price for our product in the Massachusetts and New York markets, so that farmers can actually have a sustainable living economically. We can support farming all we want with various subsidies. Until farming becomes an economically sustainable profession for all Vermonters and all farmers, we are going to struggle with this issue, from how we use the land, to attracting people to be farmers, to the water quality and the land degradation issues that we've seen from past farming practices. So we need to invest in processing facilities. We need to invest in storage facilities, so that some of the smaller farms also have the opportunity to grow food and have storage for it for longer term markets than just during the season. Investing in that infrastructure is not cheap. The Working Lands Enterprise Board and that fund is wonderful, but it's not funded enough to help farms be able to invest in the infrastructure they need to expand, to be profitable in the measures that they're using, so that they don't overtax the land by stressing it to all the limits. So there's a lot of different work to be done in agriculture, and I really enjoy working with farmers all across the state to do it.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Thank you. Wendell Berry once wrote that if we plant potatoes today, the harvest might be bountiful, but we can't be sure. And so provision requires us to think today also of a diversity of food crops. And I say that because over 3/4 of Vermont's farm economy is in dairy. And that leaves this sector, but also the state, vulnerable when our dairy farms suffer. And we have a lot of opportunities here. One is remembering that not all dairy farmers are the same. And we have an opportunity here, especially as our farmers age, to listen and to work with them in crisis to help them transition and help them think about what would be helpful to creating a more sustainable and diversified production approach. The second is to remember that this sector is already changing, and we can find strength in diversifying and supporting other kinds of farms as well. Some of our farms are doing quite well, and we can learn from them. We used to have a lot of sheep, then we had a lot of apples, now we have dairy. The way we farm changes and the people who farm changes, and we can work with that in ways that move us to regenerative practices and maintain our vibrancy while still honoring the value our farmers bring to our health and our economy and our landscape. It's also a fantastic opportunity for some members of our New American community who can bring these regenerative practices right here in Vermont and tell us how to do the work that we know we need to do. If we can get a premium for our crop, we have a future. We know our future is in regenerative agriculture and in branding Vermont as a local food hub with strong ties between farms and our plates, not competing in global commodity markets. The writing is on the wall. We need to read it. If we can get that premium for our Vermont products, then our farmers might have more revenue to steward their land and also fairly pay their migrant workers. We need to remember that sustainability is human as well as natural. And we need to invest in those farms that are already transitioning to regenerative practices, as well as those who want to transition but don't have the funds to do so for a whole variety of reasons. In some cases, we can provide mortgage assistance to young farmers so that they can come in as we make these ownership transitions that we know are ahead of us. We also need to invest in building our local food system. I've talked about the power of farm to school, but there's a tremendous opportunity here to use the purchasing power of government, particularly in the middle of the COVID crisis, to help our restaurants and our farms play a powerful role in making sure that we tighten those food chains, but also bring food to the people who are feeling insecure across the state around their access to basic food. Thank you.
Our next question will be about clean water. Vermont must find a way to ensure adequate, consistent, and long-term funding for clean water, including point and non-point controls, remediation of existing water quality changes, and a remediation plan for combined sewer overflow situations. What steps would you take to ensure that water programs are adequately funded to meet our legal and moral obligations to provide all Vermonters with clean water for drinking and recreating? What policies would you consider to ensure that we are fully cleaning and protecting Vermont's water? Starting with Pat.
Well, as an attorney, I've sued big corporations and represented the powerless against the powerful. The big corporations get away with all kinds of things, and I think that a lot of people know it, but the Scott administration will not do anything about it. We need to hold polluters accountable at every level of government. Under the Scott administration, they've had basically carte blanche to dump waste and harmful chemicals in our rivers and our lakes and in Lake Champlain. Let's have some laws with teeth and actually invest the money to enforce these laws. A budget is more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. It represents our values. Republican administrations, including the Scott administration, have underfunded programs to the point where they no longer function. I believe that it's intentional, and I believe that it's ideological, and I think that there would be a big change if I'm elected governor.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Thank you. A couple months ago, I spoke to a parent who was tearful because she found out that her child had likely been exposed to toxins in her drinking water, possibly for years. You know, I can only think of how she felt as a mother because I have kids myself. We're at a point now where some Vermonters are afraid of drinking the water out of their taps or swimming in Lake Champlain because of the potential harm to their health. When we fail to ensure our water is clean today, we compromise the health of our children in the future, and we also raise the cost to them of cleaning up so that they can't grow healthy, but they also have to pay the cost for our poor decisions. This is on all of us, and we need to think about it both in terms of cleaning up our water, but given how difficult it's been to get state commitment to cleaning up our water, we also have to think about how to keep toxins out of water in the first place. This isn't just a farmer issue or an industry responsibility. When our household waste is shipped to Coventry and the resulting leachate is brought back to the Montpelier wastewater system, the PFAS that end up in that come all the way through that cycle from our home to that wastewater. Let's talk about cleanup first. In a time of financial challenge, it's more important than ever to make sure that we're committing funds to improve our municipal wastewater systems, restore wetlands, improve stormwater management, retrofit our roads, and implement our best management practices on farms so that all of them can do their bit to keep our water clean. But let's also keep it out. We need to make sure that the people promoting an industry aren't the people regulating the industry, and we have to stop subsidizing polluters, which is what we do when we allow polluters to pollute and then ask taxpayers to pay up the bill.
Thank you. David.
Well, I've been a long and strong proponent of finding the funds to ensure that our water sources are clean and safe, but also proponent of policies that would stop the pollution from happening in the first place. We obviously need to support bills that the governor vetoed, like the medical monitoring program, which was developed after the PFAS contamination in Bennington County, to say folks who have been exposed, the chemical companies that produced those chemicals ought to pay for the monitoring for these folks for the rest of their lives. With the movie The Devil We Know, we've learned that these chemical companies have known these ramifications for 30 years. They should be held accountable for the costs of not only monitoring and the medical care for folks, but also need to be held accountable for the future and not follow their false presentation of science to back their toxic pollutants. We need to invest in our dairy industry to say, you know what, instead of subsidizing the dairy industry with tens of millions of federal and state dollars every year to produce buffer zones or areas of managing their land differently, let's invest in a bottling plant to get money out of the marketplace that would actually bring far more money into Vermonters' pockets, far more into the dairy farmers' pockets, so that we could actually use our investment dollars then to work on the combined sewer overflows and the other areas where we're seeing serious runoff and pollution, not just from ag land, but from urban land with impervious surfaces. As a senator, I'm going to wrap up though. As a senator on an ag committee, vice chair, I was a strong proponent of a per parcel fee, which was widely supported, that was going to also generate revenues for clean water activities.
Thank you, David. Now we're going to move on to a question about budgeting. So Vermont lawmakers are anticipating revenue losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars for the upcoming fiscal year. How do you propose to respond to these anticipated budget shortfalls while maintaining the state's commitment to core government services at a time of great need for many Vermonters, from ensuring access to food and housing and education for all, while also addressing ongoing issues like climate change and cleaning up our polluted waters? And we will start with Rebecca.
2 minutes or two.
Thank you. If you've read some of the statements that we put out, you know that I'm very concerned about this issue. Right now, what families need is cash. Families need cash so they can feed their families, pay their rent, and take care of their children. If we played by Governor Scott's playbook, we would systematically disinvest in people in the coming years and rely on a trickle-down model. That's why he's already pushed for 10% across-the-board cuts in state agencies, even though it's unclear what the revenues are that will be available to help support us through this crisis. It's also why he pushed for school budget revotes in every school district, knowing full well that the districts that would be harmed the most are the ones with the least ability to pay, precisely at a time when our Vermont communities are going to need more support than ever to come out of this economic crisis. These cuts would throw people out of jobs at a time when our unemployment numbers are already high and food insecurity is higher than any of us have seen it in our lifetimes. Right now, what Vermonters need is confidence and certainty that government is going to have their back and going to be pushing as much cash into the economy as possible until we can recover, so that families can care for their families and get back on their feet, and businesses can be viable when we come through this moment. It's not going to work to have trickle-down economics. Now more than ever, we need to invest in our people and in our public services. This is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity to think better and think differently across all sectors about how we shape the future we want. I believe in Vermont, and I know that when everyone can meet our needs, our basic needs equitably, we can do this and we can create resilient communities that can rise to the front. I can give you one example. In the context of education, we know that we can't get back to work if we don't have good childcare, and we know that our childcare sector is struggling. We can look at ways to tighten the partnership between schools and childcares, take advantage of the footprint that we already support to bring down the cost of care. I spoke to one mother who last year spent $185 on childcare every week. This year, she only spends $50 because of a partnership on childcare. We can do that. And just think what it would do to our communities if we could leave $135 a week in the pocket of every family.
Fine.
Thank you. Now we're going to move to David.
Well, thank you. For one, austerity budgeting is certainly not the right solution when so many Vermonters are struggling. When the unemployment rolls problem started to occur, I sent a letter to the administration saying, get checks out the door in order to help people pay their bills. And it was 2 days later that the governor then announced that he was going to get checks out the door. Leadership is about making the statements when you're in a position to do so. We've seen this playbook out of the Scott administration of trying to cut education and cut other budgets ever since he got into office. At the beginning of his administration, he moved to delay school budgets, and I was the only candidate here who spoke out about not delaying those budgets, not delaying those votes, and supporting our schools publicly and vociferously with our teachers and environmental groups, which was actually part of the Blue-Green Alliance that I worked with both labor and environmental groups to bring voices together so we could stand in solidarity. We had that protest on the State House steps. It was the first time the governor saw real opposition to one of his ideas, which was about delaying school budgets to cut our schools when we actually need to invest in our kids. I also brought an idea to the governor to look at our human services and our education budgets to look for ways to save money by blending the frontline worker programs with the kids that have really needed assistance and service, not just while they're in school, but before in school, because we've learned so much about how from 0 to 4, kids develop so many of their social and learning opportunity skills. If we blend those services, we could both save money and work towards a better continuum of service to create better outcomes. I'm also the only candidate who regularly brings up a progressive taxation system. The reality is our neoliberal policies are what's concentrated wealth in the hands of white people and already those who are already wealthy. And it's time, if we're really going to look at both economic justice, racial justice, and climate justice, to say it's no longer okay to accumulate wealth on the back of the planet or the back of working people who are struggling. We need a progressive taxation system so that we don't do these regressive policies of cutting the budget by 8 and 10 and more percent. That's going to disproportionately affect working people who are struggling. We need to take money now from the Trump tax cuts and from the wealthiest Vermonters to invest in our future in Vermont. If we don't do that, we're going to miss both the opportunity and we're going to leave a lot of people behind. Again, I've been outspoken about progressive taxation for 20 years. I've worked with people across the state to support that idea. And as governor, we'll get that passed so that we don't do austerity budgeting.
Fine.
Thank you. And Pat?
Well, the budget is going to be a challenge with the coronavirus and the impacts that it has. There's no denying that it is a challenge. But the federal government is going to help with the help of Senator Leahy and Senator Sanders and also Congressman Welch. There will be help on the way for these kinds of problems, but we need to invest in infrastructure. And I know that it's a topic that many of us have talked about, but many of the programs I support, including the environmental ones, require us to increase investments during an economic downturn. We can't just simply cut our way out of this. So there are a few ways that I would think that we should be able to generate some new revenue. One is to tax pot. I mean, if it's going to be legal, then it should be taxed, just like we tax hard liquor or any other sort of, wine, beer, cigarettes, things like that. And it's one of the ways. But Massachusetts and Canada are doing it, and Colorado. So why not us? And another way to generate revenue is a more progressive income tax. We don't believe the millionaires are going to head for the hills if we raise their taxes. On the contrary, during the pandemic, the housing market has skyrocketed with people eager to move to Vermont. And another thing that we haven't really talked about are cutting private contracts. Many of the tens of millions of contracted services paid for with general fund dollars could be done internally and at a lower rate. We need to eliminate the private out-of-state corrections contract that taxpayers are paying nearly $8 million for. There have been a lot of ideas that have been talked about, and they're good ideas, but Governor Scott is the vetoes everything. And we need to, be progressive, but we also need to be democratic, and we need to be creative. And that's, one of those are the ways that I would look at the budget problem.
Thanks, Pat. Just to let the candidates know, we're going to skip question 9 and go straight to question 10, so we have more time for audience member questions. So I'm going to hand it off to Lily now.
Thanks, Sheldon. The next question is about the future of Vermont's forests. Vermont stands at the center of the largest remaining block of deciduous temperate forest in the world, and we have uniquely rich biodiversity. As a result, Vermont's connected forest blocks create critical wildlife corridors that can support thousands of species, which is increasingly important given the uncertainties of climate change. But the percentage of Vermont's landscape that is forested is in decline. While over 75% of Vermont's lands are forested, the vast majority of this land is owned privately, setting the stage for even more development of forest land with the transition of ownership. What policies and investments would you push to address this problem and preserve our important, connected, climate-resilient forest lands? We'll start with David.
Well, thank you. I want to start by saying I was in the legislature when we did the huge purchase of the Atlas timberlands in the Northeast Kingdom area to create and protect that incredible biodiverse area from further development. We have a strong history in Vermont of protecting Vermont in terms of buying development rights and so forth of both farm and forestry land. And we need to consider expanding that. As was mentioned by Pat, that right now we've got out-of-state folks buying up land sight unseen. Maybe we could include a property transfer tax supplement on higher end properties to generate more revenue for VHCB to put into both affordable housing concentrated in our village centers and to buy those development rights from landowners so they don't break up their land. We also have to make sure we pass the Act 250 bill that looks to support the opportunity for protecting the big rural areas and forest lands while concentrating development in our village centers. We have to look at policies across the board that incent folks moving into village centers, both from an economic development perspective, which would help small stores in rural areas have more people living and working nearby, but also to reduce the sprawl factor that is fragmenting our land. We have to look at some of the larger farms and say, as those transition out of being dairy or transition out of family holdings in dairy, that maybe we make them into cooperative land for multiple farms to be on that land so that they can use that land well, and maybe even have some of that land come back into forestry. We have to do a number of ideas around financial remuneration for forest landowners through carbon sequestration payments, just as we would do for agriculture with grasslands. We also need to do that in our forest areas. We need to think about shifting our economy to one that takes into account all of these different economic impacts so that those forest landowners don't feel that the only way they can pay their bills is to sell off one housing lot after another housing lot, which leads to more forest fragmentation. Our economic system has led to this, and we need to adjust the economic system to get away from this continued pattern.
Thank you, David. Moving on to Rebecca.
Thank you. I just want to start by thanking Pat for correcting the record. Every candidate on this call understands and is committed to the principle of progressive taxation and believes that everybody, including the wealthy, need to pay their fair share. And everybody on this call has also talked about new sources of revenue. But taxation is complicated, and proposals look really simple and good on their face, sometimes don't work out as well. You know, Warren Buffett pays less in income tax than his secretary. There are ways to capture wealth. It takes care and it takes careful attention. There's a reason some of these bills never moved in the legislature legislature because people weren't sure they'd capture the resources that we need, and they weren't going to make the money go where it needed to go. On the question of forests, this is a huge opportunity for us. And we know that one of the challenges we have is that the market value of forest lands has increased a lot. Well, the value of those lands has not. And people literally can't afford to hold on to their forest. And older landowners are increasingly older, and they're more likely to have these ownership transitions, which means the time to address this problem is right now. There are many solutions here. We can recognize the critical value of good forest practices in protecting our forests against fragmentation, and in making sure that our forests can help pay for themselves. We need to work with our loggers, with our foresters, and with private sector partners and municipal leaders to identify opportunities. One of the ones that I had a great set of conversations around was that the second growth, the scrap trees in our forests, can be used to make new green carbon storing building materials that are, and it's a kind of wood that's unique to our Vermont landscape that we could use to produce it. This is the kind of role that government can play in connecting our foresters to markets and to new economic opportunities that bring revenue and wealth into the state, but protect our forests while providing for carbon sequestration. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Well, I think we need to stop logging the Green Mountain National Forest now. I mean, once the forests are gone, they rarely come back. It takes generations for them to return. And if there's already been development, they're never going to come back. We should thoughtfully look at purchasing forests through the Vermont Land Trust and other programs while we, crack down on reckless development at the same time. But I believe we should go further. We should invest in restoring wetland habitats and make conservation agreements with some of these private landowners. There are many barriers a governor can put into place to stop dangerous projects, and I'll use my office to do so. But the most important thing an elected official can do is to educate communities. We're collectively in the dark, and we need to fundamentally change how we think and what we do. And if I'm elected, I'll be out there with protesters if I need to be.
Okay, so I think now we have a few minutes to do some audience questions, and people have been putting a lot of great conversation and thoughts. So I'm going to go to a couple. We'll see how many we can get through. So we'll make each of these 1 minute responses for each of you. So the first question from Jack Cushman: one of the main sources of diversity now and in the future in Vermont is immigration. What specific policies would you pursue to make Vermont a more welcoming, attractive, and sustainable destination for a diverse pool of immigrants to help build our state's future? And we will start with Rebecca.
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is encourage absolutely everybody on this fall to vote blue up and down the ticket in November, because we know that we have failed to have reasonable immigration reform that allows us to access and be the place that many families choose to live because they can and they want to contribute to a bright future for our state. So we need to vote for change. We need to vote for change at every level. And if you can support people who are working to flip the Senate, please do so, because that's what we need here in Vermont. In Vermont, I have worked hard to make sure that we support the schools and the school districts that support our new American communities, because I know that when we take care of people who come here, often because they seek a bright future, just as our ancestors did before us, they will bring their bright hearts and their bright minds to the work of creating a bright future for our state. We know that the new American community is the only bright demographic spot in the state. They're younger than the average Vermonter. They're more likely to be employed than the average Vermonter, and they're more likely to be employed in some of our high growth and manufacturing sectors, in places where they're in green jobs, but also creating wealth and opportunity for the state. They're essential to our future, and I will do everything I can to make them feel welcomed here and like they're vital, valued members of our communities.
Thank you. Next will be Pat.
Well, people outside of Vermont, especially young people, look at Vermont and they don't see it as a very welcoming place. There's not enough diversity, and there's an image that we are not diverse, which is also a reality. My daughter, Sunrise, grew up in Manchester, Vermont, where she went to school and grade school. She's now in her early 40s, and she's my campaign manager. But I was able to convince her to come back to Vermont to be my campaign manager for my campaign for governor. But one of the things that she said was, Dad, Vermont has this image of being a white state, which we need to be more inclusive, and we need to have more things in Vermont that are attractive to young people. It's not just an image; it's it's a reality. And young people do want to come to Vermont, and they do need to have jobs, and they do need to do all the things that they want to do. But immigration is another issue. Unlike Donald Trump, I think that we should have legal and vetted immigration. Unless you're a Native American, your ancestors probably came from other countries, and that would be something that would be a great help to Vermont.
Thank you. And David?
Thank you. And listening to Sha'an Mullart or Tabitha Moore or Stefan Gillum and many others who have advised me over the years, I've learned that there's both the direct issues of racism, both subtle biases as well as the blatant racism we have in Vermont. But there's more than that. If we only talk about racism as an issue about treating our communities of color differently, we are missing the fact that communities of color, just like everybody else, want to have affordable housing, good paying jobs, safe communities. I would argue if we do the investments in the ability for people to live here, and we make investments in things like universal health care, we would actually attract far more people, not only in general across the diverse range of people, but specifically communities of BIPOC ancestry to move here and live here and thrive here. We need to do it both from an economic perspective and a racial justice perspective. We need to do it from a climate perspective as well as an education perspective. We need to tackle these issues across the board to help make everyone feel welcome here. When we talk about I'm a 7th generation or a 10th generation Vermonter, that is subtle, biased racism. Everybody is welcome from the day they move here. Our state is built, this whole system we're living in is built with immigrants. Both the good and the flaws in our system are built by all of us. Everyone who's on this debate right now are immigrants, both to this state as well as to this country. We have to continue to welcome immigrants. When President Trump got into office, I welcomed student groups from Winooski and Burlington who had created the All Are Welcome symbol. And we put that right outside my office in the Lieutenant Governor's office from day one in order to say, all are welcome in our system, all are welcome in our state, all are welcome in our democracy. I travel across the state talking to school groups regularly about participation, even when they can't vote yet, because the idea of saying you don't really have a voice until you can vote, we have to make sure people have a voice no matter what. And that's true with immigrant communities, that's true with new people that move here, that's true with students, and that's true with folks that have lived here for a long time. We need to create a welcoming society economically and racially to attract BIPOC communities.
Thank you. We're now going to a question from Del Waterhouse, an issue that was very important pre-COVID and increasingly so as we head into the future. What would you do to significantly expand Vermont's affordable housing opportunities? And I'm going to start now with Pat.
Well, affordable housing is necessary for young people and for all people. We also need to provide childcare for people and for affordable housing to be, to work. We have, the sort of a chicken and the egg problem. We have people that want to move here, but on the other hand, we do have, people we don't have enough housing. So one of the things that that is necessary to think about is that we're an aging population here in Vermont, And as people age, we have employers who need workers, and providing affordable housing and providing childcare. Those are things that are of great importance to people like my daughter and like all of the young people who would move here to Vermont.
Thank you. Next, David.
Well, I've discussed affordable housing a number of times with respect to the Green Mountain New Deal, but also we can look into bonding for housing. I know that there's a disagreement between different people in the administration about whether we could do more bonding or not, but it's pretty clear that when you're talking about investing in long-term assets, you can bond for them. And with more affordable housing in our village centers, as well as the investment in broadband, we will actually expand our economic opportunity to easily be able to pay off those bonds. We also need to look to cities like Burlington and others around the state that have added inclusionary zoning to make sure that when a developer is building housing, if they want to do bigger projects, they have to make sure to include affordable housing in their projects. Vermont cannot actually no longer be a state for the haves and the have-nots, where all the investment in private development is in higher end homes and luxury properties around the state, while working people are struggling with low wages. You want to talk about affordable housing? Let's raise the minimum wage. The governor vetoed the minimum wage twice. Thankfully, this last time, the legislature was able to override it. But we need to build a livable wage. When you look at affordability in this state, the Public Assets Institute made it very clear that our costs in Vermont are very average across New England, but our incomes are 18% lower. So you want to talk about affordable housing, it's both building housing with affordability metrics, and it's about raising wages. It's about universal health care. It's about building broadband so people can live and work in the communities. It's a combination of many things. I actually live in 2 converted silos, but we have to stop thinking in silos in the different agencies in government, and we have to stop thinking in silos around one aspect of our economy. These things are all interconnected.
Thank you. Next, Rebecca.
Thank you for the question. This is one of the issues I heard about most as I traveled around the state before we went into our COVID shutdown. And there are many ways that we can address it. I think we know it's critical. The lack of housing is keeping people in jail who shouldn't be in jail. It's keeping people from getting treatment or supportive services because they can't find a stable place to live. It threatens the viability of education for children when they can't be stable in a home and go consistently to school. We know this has to be a top priority. And there's several things we have to do because fixing the challenge of affordable housing is going to be different in different parts of the state. So we need flexible policy that accounts for the diversity of the state. We know that in many places we do need inclusionary zoning that incentivizes diversity of housing development. We also know we need to be concentrating our development in affordable housing that's climate friendly, but in walkable downtowns. But to do that, you have to have basic wastewater treatment, municipal wastewater systems that can accommodate that density. And the state hasn't invested in that basic infrastructure in years. That has to be the first step in many communities. We also need to streamline the permitting process. I live on the border with New Hampshire. And one of the things that we see here is the affordable housing that is going up in our area is mostly going up on the New Hampshire side of the river. And one of the reasons is the permitting process, the way it's structured, just takes a longer time in Vermont. It doesn't have to be done serially. There are probably ways to tighten those connections to bring down the time. Because when you're trying to build affordable housing, every month of delay before you can get your shovel in the ground raises the cost of the project, which makes it less affordable. And so those are the kinds of things we need to do to make sure that we're building housing. We also have to address other issues that make it more affordable for families. Minimum wage is not enough. We need to be training people so they can get living wages and bringing it up.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now we are going to turn to our last question. And thank you everyone for submitting all those questions in the chat. So our last question is, if you were elected governor, what do you think would be unique about your vision and experience that would help advance a future for Vermont that embodies equity, a thriving economy that works for everyone, and supports a healthy environment? And we will start with David.
Well, thank you. I first got involved in politics nearly 30 years ago because of the climate crisis and because I was inspired by Bernie to see that you could be an activist agitator in the system while not taking corporate money and not following the path of always doing what the parties wanted, but actually what people wanted. And as a student at UVM, I was organizing the 20th anniversary Earth Day around that same time. I've been dedicated to climate and environmental issues my whole life, and getting involved not as a legislator, and then as a senator, and then as lieutenant governor. I've continued to hold those values all the way through in working towards issues and policies that are going to help Vermonters and clean up our environment and build a future for all. I remember 4 years ago when I got elected lieutenant governor, and I was extremely saddened that night, of course, by the election of this president. And I thought about my 10-year-old daughter and two issues: the climate crisis and the Supreme Court. Now, thankfully, the other day, the Supreme Court finally had a good ruling. But the reality is this president has torn down much of the potential of our future through his 4 years in office. We need a governor that's going to stand up to this president, not occasionally with words saying, well, we'll do the Paris Accord, or we'll do the right thing in reaction to his wrong thing. We need a proactive governor who's going to lead this state and have this state be a leader on economic justice, racial justice, and environmental justice. We need a leader who's been in the trenches fighting for these issues for 20 years and has worked with people all across the state so we can build statewide support for these incredibly important issues. We're seeing such phenomenal grassroots energy right now, whether it was the proposal to close the state colleges or now the incredible support coming out across the state for Black Lives Matter. We are at a turning point with great opportunity. I believe that my administration would be the strongest on these issues and that I have the best chance of beating this governor. I got 7,000 more votes than Phil Scott 2 years ago. Most people don't recognize that because most people don't look deep into those numbers. But the reality is Vermonters have supported me more than this governor. And when we take him on head to head, we're going to need that grassroots support from across the state to win this election. It's going to be an incredibly hard election to win, no matter which of the three of us becomes the nominee. However, with COVID-19, being someone who's been around the state for 20 years, working with Vermonters, having that connection to Vermonters is going to be beneficial both for the election as well as for serving as your governor. As an organic farmer, I've worked the land.
Time.
Fair enough. I'll respect that completely.
Thank you, David. I'm now going to hand it off to Rebecca.
Thank you. As some of you know, I grew up in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Sudan, where people didn't have basic privileges like universal public education, where there was grotesque income inequality, where people couldn't vote. And I got to see firsthand how racial and ethnic discrimination, where lack of opportunity left people desperate and often led them to degrade the environment. That had a profound impact on me. It's part of why I chose to go into public education. And it's a huge piece of why I am so committed to equity. And I know that because of that, I spent my year in public education as a teacher, as a district leader, and as your Secretary of Education, working through hard issues with diverse communities, managing big budgets, helping us figure out what we could agree on to actually get to work and stop talking on building the better future that our children deserve. I fought hard battles against an environment often where there was never enough money, and we had to figure out how to squeeze every single drop of value out of every dollar for our core values and the work we cared about. And I also learned that it wasn't about new Americans versus our native people of color who've been living here for years. We need to make sure every Vermonter, our BIPOC communities, our transgender students, our new Americans, and the students who are here because their families were immigrants years ago, all have access to the basic commitment to life, liberty, and happiness that many of us who are privileged like myself take for granted. Because if we don't provide that, we are not living up to our deals, and we lose the benefit of their good contributions to our communities. As your Secretary of Education, I made equity my hallmark, and you can go and ask people in school districts about that. And I also developed a reputation for not just talking, but for getting things done for the people who depended on our work. Because I know the job of government is to show up when people need help and to expand opportunity so they have what they need to go out and live freely and with dignity and make the lives they want. As your governor, I will ask that my cabinet review every single bill that comes to my desk through two lenses. First, what is the impact on equity? What is the impact on our marginalized communities in Vermont? Those on whom we have too long shut the door. And I will also ask them to look at the impact on climate in our environment, because I know if we don't have a safe and healthy environment, we don't have a future for our state. I list each of these reasons because I believe our current levels of toxic inequality impair our ability to address our climate goals. We can't solve our equity challenge without addressing climate and vice versa. We need a strong candidate who can take on Phil Scott. The eventual nominee is going to have to be ready to take whatever Phil Scott and the Republican Governors Association sends their way. That's why I'm prepared to take on a vigorous debate of the issues, on all issues, and on our records. You know, when I got into this race, I was not taken seriously. It was assumed that it would either be Phil or David. I've had to work hard fighting that assumption, to get people to know me, to take seriously the idea that a woman could be governor in Vermont again. That kind of work, that kind of fight is what it's going to take to beat Phil Scott. And I'm not getting support simply because I'm next in line. I'm going to work to earn it every day. And I really hope to earn the votes of the people here today and to work as your governor.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to hand it over to Steve.
Do we hear Pat?
Oh, Pat, sorry. I'm so sorry. I lost track of the order.
Well, I am a lawyer, and we face a lot of challenges in the upcoming 2 years. Where because I'm a lawyer and I have training. I'm sorry. Yeah, and because of my legal background, I have a different perspective than the other candidates in the race. If you have a legal problem, who do you call on? You call on a lawyer. I've been the past president of the Vermont Trial Lawyers Association, and I have over 3 decades of experience dealing with legal issues. I've tried over 75 jury trials in the courts of Vermont, all throughout Vermont, from St. Albans to Brattleboro to Bennington, to Woodstock. And I think that is what distinguishes me from the other candidates. And I think it's an important, asset to have when you are governor of Vermont. And that's the perspective. And it's a different sort of look that you have. I'm not from Montpelier. I'm not of Montpelier. I'm not a politician. I've been on the school board, and I've also been I'm also the moderator of the Village of Old Bennington, and I'm a past trustee. But I would look at everything different, and I do have different skills, and I do have different backgrounds that do give me a different perspective as an outsider.
Thank you so much. Now I will pass it over to Steve.
Great. Let's see. There we go. Hi, everybody. Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. This has been a great discussion. I want to thank our candidates, Pat Winburn, Rebecca Holcomb, and David Zuckerman. This has been a great discussion. I want to let everybody know that this has been recorded, and it will be. You'll get a link to it if you want to share that or get back and review some of these things that came up. I also want to thank our organizing team, Sheldon Goodwin and Lauren Hurl from Vermont Conservation Voters, Rachel Stevens, and myself from Vermont Sierra Club. Rob Kidd, of course, with the Sierra Club, Lily Platt from the Youth Lobby, who's been a great addition to our team, and also a special shout out to the folks at 350 who couldn't be here tonight because of a school board meeting, but helped frame our questions. And I want a special thanks to the audience members who submitted questions. It's been great to see all the participation that's going on. And we look forward to hearing your feedback. And so that's it for the evening.